When most people think of ancient mysteries, they picture Egypt's pyramids or Stonehenge monuments that feel worlds away. But right here in the heartland, long before highways and harvests, Indiana's soil held cities of earth and wood, star-aligned rings, fading rock carvings, and artifacts that crossed continents before maps did. The stories are not just distant legends. They are close enough to touch. Massive earthworks that catch the solstice light. Villages bounded by palisades, half-remembered tablets carved with sacred words, and rumors of giant skeletons surfacing from riverbanks after spring floods. Indiana's past is deeper and stranger than most realize, and much of it lingers just beneath the surface. Quiet, patient, and ready to be seen. Tonight, we are going to walk the mounds, sift the mysteries, and ask a simple question with a complicated answer. When the past speaks in fragments, how do we decide what is real? From the Ohio River's lost city to vanishing villages and contested stones, this is the Midwestern history class they forgot to teach. If you ever find yourself skimming along the Ohio River near Evansville, the landscape slips past in greens and browns, quiet fields, a fringe of trees, the flash of water through cottonwoods. It does not announce itself, but behind that modest horizon lies a city that predated every European footprint on this continent. Angel Mounds, a Mississippian center, built and lived in roughly between 1000 and 1450 AD. Think less in stones and more in earth. Think less in ruins and more in form and intention. At its height, this place sprawled over 100 acres, about 75 football fields, bounded by a wooden palisade wall bristling with bastions. There was an inside and an outside, and not everyone could pass through. Step within that line and a plan unfolds. Houses clustering around open plazas, storage buildings tucked near pathways, and above it all, 211 platform mounds, rising like deliberate punctuation marks in a sentence we are still learning to read. These were not heaps of dirt. They were engineered structures, raised and reshaped over years, with flat summits that likely supported temples, council houses, or the residences of a social elite. Political power and sacred obligation shared the same address here, layered into the clay. The largest, Mound A, is a statement as much as a building, more than 600 feet long and 44 feet high, a vantage point and a proclamation. Imagine climbing to that summit at dawn, mist lying low over gardens and rooftops, a leader or spiritual figure not just above the crowd, but emblematic of a hierarchy the community understood in their bones. All around, life left its quiet confetti. Archaeologists have drawn stories from pottery sherds, bone and stone tools, gaming pieces, and ceremonial objects. But some of those stories began far from Indiana. Items traced back to the Gulf Coast and the Great Plains, proof that this was no isolated outpost. Mississippian people traded across huge distances, moving shells, copper, ideas, and ritual forms along rivers that functioned like interstate highways of an earlier world. Angel Mounds sat in that flow, absorbing and translating far-flung influences into a distinctly local expression. And still, the city keeps its counsel. The Mississippians left no written language to decode, so every conclusion depends on careful excavation and an honest admission of uncertainty. What exactly happened on top of those platforms? Were they observatories where movements of sun and star were tracked as part of a ceremonial calendar? Did priests chant and leaders adjudicate from wooden structures that have long since returned to soil? Burials nearby hint at a society of ranks, some graves accompanied by valuables, others stark and unadorned, suggesting that power and privilege were as stratified as the mounds themselves. Then comes the hardest question. Why did they leave? Around 1,450. Angel Mounds was abandoned without the scorch marks, siege layers, or mass graves that would make the ending obvious. Theories ripple and overlap. Climate swings may have pinched harvests or pushed the river into ruinous moods. Disease could have spread along the same trade routes that once carried prosperity. Political fracture within a complex society might have loosened the bonds that held it together, or perhaps the land itself, worked to exhaustion by a growing population, faltered under the weight of success. None of these explanations excludes another. Together, they sketch a plausible unraveling. One of the first people to ask these questions with method and patience was archaeologist Glenn A. Black, beginning in the 1930 seconds. He dedicated decades to Angel Mounds digging, mapping, cataloging, and inviting the site into national conversation. His work did not solve the puzzle, but it sharpened the edges. He showed how much could be known from fragments, and just as importantly, how much would always remain just out of reach. To walk the grounds today is to practice a kind of listening. Early morning is best, when fog threads the grasses and the wind keeps its own counsel in the trees. Trails carry you past low green swells that, once you know what you are looking at, resolve into architecture. A visitor center helps translate the shards and soil stains into houses and plazas. But the most persuasive interpreter is the place itself. Stand midway up a mound and look outward. A city springs back like a reflex, drum beats from a plaza, smoke lifting from cooking fires, children, dogs, barter, laughter. A ritual procession moving with the gravity of belief. The scene hangs at the edge of vision, close enough to feel, never quite to touch. What Angel Mounds refuses to be is a myth. It is stubbornly real, anchored by earthworks and artifacts and the logic of a society that was at once local and connected, spiritual and political, practical and ceremonial. People here engineered landscape into meaning. They managed resources, negotiated alliances, raised children, buried their dead with care and with difference. They rose. They thrived. And then, for reasons we still parse, they left. Perhaps that is why Angel Mound stays with you after the path returns you to your car and the Ohio River slips back into view. It rewrites the mental map. The ancient does not belong only to Egypt or Greece or Mesoamerica. It belongs to this bend in the river, this patch of prairie, this hush at dawn. And in that recognition, there is an invitation to treat the ordinary ground beneath our feet as a palimpsest, to see how much intention a community can press into earth, and to keep asking the old questions with new tools and open minds. 200 miles east of Indiana's state line, near the quiet earthworks around Newark, Ohio, a handful of stones pried from ancient mounds set off an argument that still has not settled. They were not gold, and they were not bones, but they carried a different kind of weight, the kind that can tilt a story of who arrived first, who built what, and how far the old world might have reached. In the early 1860 seconds, a local digger named David Hyrick pulled the first piece from a burial mound, a dark, polished stone shaped like a plumb bob, each of its 4 faces carved with Hebrew phrases: Holy of Holies, the Law of God, the King of the Earth, words of sanctity surfacing from Midwestern soil. It was christened the Keystone, and it lit the fuse. Months later, a companion artifact emerged, the so-called Decalogue stone, black sandstone carved like a rounded tombstone. To its center, a robed figure, Moses to some eyes, surrounded by a long Hebrew inscription that appears to set out the 10 Commandments. If these pieces were genuinely ancient, if they lay sealed in Hopewell mounds built between 100 BC and 500 AD, then the implication was staggering. It would suggest that Hebrew travelers crossed the Atlantic, interacted with native societies, and left religious relics inside ceremonial earthworks, a millennium before Columbus stirred a keel. That kind of idea grabs the imagination fast. It dovetailed neatly with 19th century diffusionist theories that were already bubbling in the Midwest, a moment when many settlers, guided by racial bias and colonial assumptions, insisted the continent's great mounds must have been built by outsiders, Vikings, Egyptians, the lost tribes of Israel, anyone but the native communities whose descendants still lived nearby. The Newark Holy Stones arrived in that atmosphere like ready-made proof, a story clicking into place with a little too much ease. From almost the beginning, professional skepticism followed close behind. Scholars pointed to the style of the script, which seemed to echo Hebrew fonts common in the 1800s more than any biblical era hand. The condition of the stones, so clean and tidy for objects supposedly buried for centuries, pinched brows. The speed of the discoveries. One sensational piece, and then another felt like a rhythm designed for headlines. And there was Hyrick himself, a figure some accused of credulity at best and complicity at worst. None of that settles the case, but it does crowd the scales. When a find perfectly answers a cultural longing, caution is a virtue. Still, not everyone filed the stones under hoax. Even now, there are researchers who argue that the carving quality, the iconography, and the sheer difficulty of pulling off such forgeries suggest serious intent rather than carnival trickery. Others keep the door open to the possibility of ancient contact. Hebrews, Phoenicians, wanderers, whose stories simply failed to survive in the written record. History is full of surprises, they say, and absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Newark Holy Stones live where curiosity enjoys ambiguity and where certainty can feel, at times, like a kind of impatience. Indiana, though not the stage of discovery, stands in the wings of this drama. Private collectors in the state handled some of the stones over the years, and Indiana-based antiquarians helped amplify diffusionist readings that placed the Midwest in a web of transoceanic influence. The same mound-building tradition that tied Ohio's Hopewell to Indiana's earthworks forms the backdrop here. The same 19th-century newspapers that reported finds from Anderson to Vincennes churned out rumors of inscribed tablets and giant bones, each clipping another thread in a tapestry of mystery. Most of those reports were exaggerated. Some were fables, but they reveal an appetite for wonder, for a past that crackles with unexpected connections that still has not gone away. Walk the logic from both sides, and you end up in the same clearing, the place where archaeology must decide what to do with outliers. If an artifact contradicts the accepted timeline, do we re-examine the timeline, or do we question the artifact? The honest answer is both. And the hard work is in the details, contextual layers, soil chemistry, tool marks, chain of custody, radiometric testing where possible, and a sober look at how culture can shape what people think they are seeing. The Newark stones ask not just whether a thing is true, but how truth gets established when the past arrives without witnesses. Meanwhile, the story has not retreated to a footnote. You can still see the stones today, displayed at the Johnson Hummer House Museum in Coshocton, Ohio. The museum does not pound a gavel either way. It presents and invites, letting visitors weigh the inscriptions against the doubts. In a way, that is the most respectful posture available. The humility to admit the limits of the record while refusing to smother the questions that keep a story alive. What keeps the Newark Holy Stones irresistible is how precisely they touch the nerve between evidence and desire. They press on the human urge to belong to something ancient, to imagine our rivers as chapters in a global epic, our mounds as footnotes to scriptures we already know. They also press on our responsibility to the people who built those mounds, whose ingenuity has too often been explained away by attributing their accomplishments to someone else. To honor both truths, to remain open to surprise, while refusing to erase the known authors of this landscape, is the narrow path. So the debate endures, as debates worth having tend to do. Maybe the stones are clever forgeries with perfect timing. Maybe they are genuine anomalies that outpaced the tools we had to understand them. Or maybe they occupy some foggy middle ground, where artifact and aspiration got tangled in the hands that carried them from soil to glass case. What is certain is the echo they have left in the region's imagination. In a century and a half, they have made the Midwest's mounds feel less like mute monuments and more like a chorus. Some voices clear, some cracked with age, all of them asking us to listen harder, look closer, and think twice before deciding what cannot be. Between the Ohio earthworks and the Indiana riverlands, the question lingers: how do we read a past that refuses to be simple? The next stop on our journey offers a harsher lesson, not about contested inscriptions, but about a village the river itself decided to rewrite. Down in the bend, where the Wabash slips toward the Ohio, there is a strip of farmland that looks as modest as any postcard of the Midwest row crops. A few cottonwoods, the hush of water working on its banks. 2 centuries ago, locals gave this place a name that tells on the ground itself: Bone Bank. They called it that because the river kept doing what rivers do, taking a bite, taking another, and with each bite, bones and pottery and human history sloughed out of the bluff like pages torn from a book. From those pages, a settlement takes shape. Most archaeologists now read Bone Bank as a major village of the Caborn-Wellborn people, an outpost of the broader Mississippian world that persisted in the lower Wabash Valley from roughly 1,400 to 1,700 AD, long after Cahokia's Great Places had quieted. The location was a prize, a bluff with a view, good soils at its feet, and the river for a road. From here, people moved goods and messages up and down the waterway, stitching themselves into a network that reached far beyond what we now call Indiana. What the land surrendered confirms that reach. Mixed into the midden of everyday life, cooking pots, stone tools, beads are things that speak the language of distance, copper from the Great Lakes, shell ornaments with a Gulf Coast accent, ceremonial objects from stranger geologies. Bone Bank was not a lonely farmstead. It was a node. And yet, for all the clues of connection, so much of what we know arrived scattered in second-hand. Early settlers hauled wagon loads of bones and artifacts away, curious and oblivious in equal measure. Some pieces drifted into museum drawers. Others went to private cabinets. A few, grimly, were said to have gone into the fields as fertilizer. By the time professionals showed up with notebooks and transit rods, whole sections had already slumped into the Wabash, as if the river meant to keep its secret after all. In the fragments that remain, you can see a community that balanced the ceremonial with the practical. There were burials with care and burials with haste. Some graves held tools, beads and vessels placed with an intentional hand. Others were spare. A handful of early accounts describe grouped interments, clusters that raise hard questions. Was there an epidemic that ripped through and demanded quick rites? A raid that left too many dead at once? We do not have the smoking layer of ash or the definitively pathological bones that would settle the story. We have hints, and an outline darkened by conjecture. Alongside the archaeology runs folklore, a shadow history that tends to swell in the telling. 19th century newspapers carried breathless reports from Bone Bank and neighboring river towns. Skulls unusually large, skeletons giant in stature, enormous axes and ornaments that seemed too grand for ordinary hands. Add in tales of double rows of teeth or bodies arranged in uncanny orientations, and you have the ingredients for legends that refuse to die. Some of these stories surely overreached, hunting headlines. Some may have misread real details, an unusually tall individual in a short-statured population, the visual trick of scattered bones stretching a measurement in soft soil, cultural practices of skull shaping mistaken for something monstrous. But even skeptics have to admit that folklore is not born from thin air. It starts with a find, a witness, a rumor, and grows in the gap left by missing documentation. And that, more than anything, is what makes Bone Bank Ache a missed archive. Angle Mounds had Glen A. Black. Anderson had WPA crews mapping circles with method. Bone Bank had erosion and curiosity without protocol. Our clearest chronicle today is a collage of museum taglines, private letters, and a handful of early field notes, stitched together to approximate a place that deserved a monograph. If this village had been studied before the bluff collapsed, it might have sharpened the picture of the centuries between the fall of the major Mississippian centers and the arrival of European settlers, a hinge in Midwestern history that still creaks with unanswered questions. Stand there now if you can, because what is left sits on private land, and the record is mostly absence. No interpretive center, no boardwalk, no sign to firm up the story with dates and diagrams. The river has softened the edges. Farming has ironed out the telltale rises. Yet Bone Bank survives in strange ways. A mislabeled drawer in a regional museum turns up a pot with a note. From the Wabash banks, a family heirloom box yields a copper bead, dull with age. A collector finally photographs an old letter, describing a burial cluster seen after the flood. Each rediscovered scrap is a syllable that, when read together, almost forms a sentence. There is a temptation to end on lament, and there is justice in that. Places like Bone Bank are finite. When they go, there is no redo. But there is also a quieter invitation. The site's vanishing forces the larger lesson into focus. The past does not only live in grand mounds and preserved parks. Sometimes it flickers in the edges, river cuts, field margins, the bottom drawer of a county museum. Sometimes it asks us to be better stewards on the second try, to document before we disturb, to consult descendant communities about care and context, to recognize that what looks like just a bluff can be the last library of a people's daily life. If this all feels like a story of loss, it is because it is, yet loss can still teach. Bone Bank reminds us that rivers edit history with a slow, indifferent pen, and that our best defense is attention early, sustained, and humble. Somewhere under that gentle ground in Posey County, under soybean roots and river silt, there are still pieces we have not met yet. And if they never surface, if the Wabash keeps them, then what we can hold on to is the outline. A bluff-top town of traders and farmers, a people who navigated a wide world with canoes and ceremony, and a name Bone Bank that refuses to let the living forget what the water once revealed. Follow the Wabash upstream from Bone Bank, and you will find the same rumor surfacing again and again, not just along one river, but across clippings and courthouse basements statewide. Giants, not the hardwood legends of a basketball court, but skeletons said to stretch 7, 8, even 10 feet, lifted from earthen mounds as casually as stones from a field. In the 19th century, these stories slipped between crop reports and county meetings. Posey County, Knox County along the White River, around Anderson, near Vincennes. Each tale wearing the same costume. A farmer's plow strikes a rise, a skull rolls out, the town gathers, an antiquarian arrives with big opinions, and then the bones vanish into a private cabinet, a museum basement, or the fog of memory. The descriptions are as vivid as they are variable. Some accounts insist on double rows of teeth, jawbones so large you could wear them like a carnival mask, skulls longer than any the onlookers had seen. Others focus on the grave goods, copper tools, stone axes the size of oars, ornaments that, in the telling, grew more ornate with each retelling. The mounds themselves, built by Adena, Hopewell, and later Mississippian peoples, were already magnets for wonder to settlers unused to earthen architecture. The idea that something superhuman lay underneath every geometric swell of soil seemed to make a strange, intuitive sense. Archaeology's early years did not help. Before professional standards took hold, the Midwest was a theater of casual digs, shovels for souvenirs, notebooks optional, measurements taken by eye on uneven ground. In soft, slumping earth, a femur that has shifted out of place can exaggerate itself. Scattered bones suggest lengths they never had. A 6'2" individual, uncommon in a 19th century population of shorter average stature, could become a giant by comparison, especially when the find arrived with copper or shell that signaled status. And what reads as double rows of teeth can be any number of dental pathologies. Supernumerary teeth, heavy wear patterns, or a simple misreading of a damaged maxilla. As for elongated skulls, head shaping was practiced by some indigenous groups. Cradleboard use and intentional cranial modification leave forms that are striking but cultural, not monstrous. None of that fully erases the allure. Even now, the idea of giants hums at the edge of Midwestern folklore. Part of it is narrative gravity. 10-foot skeleton found in cornfield sells more papers than more pottery sherds recovered from mound. Part of it is the human appetite for the extraordinary. The wish for an older, stranger world just beneath the pasture grass. And part of it, if we are candid, is mistrust. A suspicion that institutions collected outliers and hid them because they did not fit the model. The Smithsonian is often drafted into this plot, accused of swallowing uncomfortable evidence. The trouble is, the evidence for a cover-up is thinner than the fog over a fall river. What we have in hand, across a century and a half, is this. No verified, modern standard documentation of a skeleton over 7 feet from an Indiana mound. We have mismeasurements, missing chains of custody, vanished bones, and headlines that grew in the telling dot. But to dismiss all of it as swindle would be to miss something important. The giant stories are a mirror. They reflect how people in the 19th century encountered the deep past. Sudden, uncontextualized, unframed by science or collaboration with descendant communities. Imagine stepping onto your field after a flood and finding a human skull sunning itself in the silt. What story do you reach for? The one at hand, the one that flatters your sense of discovery, the one the newspaper will print. And because the mounds were poorly protected, the evidence had a way of evaporating, picked clean by curiosity, pocketed, or quite literally washed away. Folk narrative rushed in where field notes should have stood. There are, too, the honest, tall outliers, individuals who, in life, would have towered over their peers. In any population, the bell curve has a tail. A 6.5-foot person, buried with ceremony in a community of mostly 5'7" men, would feel mythic when rediscovered by descendants of smaller 19th century towns. Scale is relative. Awe is elastic. If you want a middle path through the thicket, it might look like this. The giants of Indiana were real as stories. Born from real encounters with ancient graves, disrupted at the wrong time, in the wrong way, read through the wrong lens. They were amplified by competition between newspapers, by the era's hunger for spectacular pasts, and by a stubborn refusal, rooted in bias, to credit indigenous societies with engineering feats without importing an exotic race of builders. The persistence of the legend tells us less about bone measurements and more about the vacuum that forms when stewardship fails. Where context is stripped away, myth is the only narrator left. And yet, stand at dusk on the rim of a surviving mound, say, at Anderson's Great Circle as the evening cool settles, and it is easy to feel why the giant stories continue to tug. The earthworks themselves remain impressive, the skywork precise, the distances vast that trade once crossed. If you do not have post holes and pottery typologies at the front of your mind, you reach for symbols large enough to fit the feeling. Giants are one such symbol. They are an attempt to explain a scale of effort that still humbles the present. So where does that leave us? With rigor, and with room for wonder. Rigor says, catalog finds under the supervision of professionals. Consult the native nations most connected to these sites. Test, measure, document. Protect what remains. Wonder says, it is fine to feel small under a sky-aligned earthwork, to hear drums we can't prove and stories we can't translate. The trick is not to let wonder invent people who were not there, or take credit from those who were. Indiana's past does not need 10-foot skeletons to be extraordinary. The truth, what we can hold in our hands and date in our labs, is already remarkable. Engineered landscapes, ceremonial calendars, trade routes woven from the Rockies to the Gulf. If we listen closely, the mounds tell a story deep enough to fill the night without adding a single inch. And if we honor that depth, we may yet hear clearer voices next time the earth decides to speak. Just off the Wabash near Vincennes, the land wears its history almost to nothing. At first glance, you see only pale limestone, sun-bleached and rain-scoured, the kind of rock your eye slides over without stopping. Then, as the light shifts, the surface answers back. Faint grooves, a cluster of lines that should not be there, a figure that might be animal or symbol or both. These are the Vincennes Petroglyphs, a set of carvings so quiet that you could walk past them a dozen times and never notice, and yet so stubborn they have clung to river weather for centuries. Indiana's mounds speak in whole landscapes. Here, the past pressed its voice into stone, sentence by sentence, until the grammar blurred. It is not a cave panel in the west, not a sheltered alcove. The carvings sit on soft, exposed limestone close to the water, a risky canvas for anything meant to last. Each rise and fall of the river works like sandpaper. Winter ice pries at edges. Summer storms hush the lines under a sheet of runoff. That vulnerability is part of the message. Whoever chose this surface knew it would weather. They carved anyway. Maybe that was the point. To place marks where travelers would pass, where the river's long traffic would see them, where a message could greet the generations who moved along this ancient water road. What do we see when we lean in? Geometries first. Crisscross patterns. Chevrons. Circles that might be eyes or planets, or nothing so literal. Then the suggestions of forms, antlered shapes, serpentine lines, a figure whose head could be bird, whose body could be human. Time has worked them blunt. so a catalog feels as tentative as reading through frost on glass. But the intention remains. These are not scratches from carts or plow blades. They are deliberate, cut with tools, and with a patience that invites witness. Dating them is its own humility lesson. There is no signature, no inscription, no layer of charcoal that will obligingly yield a number in a lab. Based on comparison with regional traditions, some archaeologists place the work in the late woodland period, say 500 to 1000 AD, but they could be older. They could be younger. What matters more than a precise date is the cultural neighborhood. The same peoples who raised the mounds and earth rings across the Ohio Valley, Adena, Hopewell, then later, communities inheriting those traditions also told stories in materials that last: clay, copper, and sometimes stone. If the mounds were calendars and sanctuaries, a petroglyph could be their road sign, their note in the margin, their prayer pinned to the river's bulletin board. Theories multiply in the absence of a decoder key, and each carries its own kind of plausibility. One reads the panel as sacred geography, a place where the land itself had power, riverbend, outcrop, open sky, and carving acknowledged that charge. Another sees the panel as a map, not with the geometry of a surveyor but with the logic of a traveler. Marks for crossings, boundaries, safe harbors, a promise that hospitality or neutrality held here. A third hears narrative, a scene cut into stone, the way rock art in the Southwest frames hunts, dances, migrations. In that reading, Vincennes is a paragraph in a longer river story, one chapter among many panels that once dotted this corridor. Given how the Wabash has shifted its banks, how fields were plowed and roads graded, it would be no surprise if other chapters vanished without a record. What we do know, painfully, is that almost nothing formal has been done here. The site never drew the WPA mapmakers who traced Anderson's rings, nor the long campaigns that made Angel Mounds a teaching ground. The Vincennes carvings were noted by early 20th century antiquarians, mentioned in passing, then mostly left alone, too obscure for tourist brochures, too weathered to lure grant money, too exposed to guarantee a future. There is no fence. There is no watch. The best guard is indifference, which is also the worst. That neglect raises uncomfortable questions. How do we steward a message we can't fully read? How do we protect a text the river is actively erasing? Museums can hold pots and points. A petroglyph is part of its landscape, and moving it would kill half its meaning. That leaves documentation and care. High-resolution imaging, 3D scans that catch grooves the eye misses, respectful access corridors that keep boots and bikes from shaving another century off the panel, partnerships with descendant native nations whose voices should lead the decisions. The goal is not to turn a quiet rock into a spectacle. It is to honor a sentence that someone wanted to be heard. You could argue, of course, that its fading is also part of the truth. Most human messages are temporary. Bark decays, paint peels, earthworks slouch. Even limestone unspools under a patient river. But transience does not erase intention. The people who stood here and cut these lines chose stone over wood, a deliberate bid for endurance. They made a bet that their marks would outlast them. And across centuries, that bet has mostly paid. The least we can do is meet their effort with our own, to look carefully, to record what we see, to keep the place from being loved to death or ignored to disappearance. All of this might sound overly solemn for a few faint grooves. If so, there is an easy remedy. Go, find the limestone, and let your eyes adjust as the light leans lower in the day. Kneel, so the surface stops reflecting and starts revealing. Trace the lines in the air above the stone, not with your fingers, which would add oil where none is needed. Listen. A river pulls at the bank. Birds needle the shoreline. After a minute, the panel begins to read itself. Not in translation, but in tone. The intent is audible. We were here. This place mattered. The water carries more than fish and driftwood. Indiana is not known for rock art. It is known for earth and sky circles of soil that catch the solstice, platforms that lifted temples and leaders above the floodplain. That is precisely why this panel matters. It is an outlier, proof that expression wore multiple forms here. that the people who measured sunrise in earth could also leave notes on stone. The Vincennes Petroglyphs won't give up a tidy story. They do not need to. Their existence expands the range of what we think we know, calling us to a broader, more generous picture of a landscape that has always held more than meets the first glance. In a few minutes, we will return to the language of earthwork and alignment, to a circle that still catches the sun with an accuracy that feels like devotion. But before we go, let the rock say what it can. Even blurred, even incomplete, it speaks a low voice in a loud world, asking us to slow down long enough to hear. Leave the whisper of limestone and step back into the language of earth and sky. In Anderson, Indiana, inside a green hush most drivers never notice, the ground has been shaped into instruments that still play when the light is right. This is Mounds State Park, a precinct of circles and embankments assembled more than 2 millennia ago by Hopewell-era builders who cut time into the landscape, then taught the sun to keep their appointments. The centerpiece is called the Great Mound, and it resists the casual glance. From the trail, it looks like a gentle rise, the sort of ridge you would attribute to glacial whim. But climb the path to its rim, and the plan declares itself a near-perfect circular earthwork, roughly 400 feet across, its wall an embankment with a wide opening, cut like a careful breath on one side. Stand in the center at dawn, on the summer solstice, and the sun threads that opening as if the builders had reached across centuries to tap you on the shoulder. That accuracy is not luck. It is observation matured into architecture, years of watching sunrise migrate along the horizon, then fixing that motion in soil so an entire community could witness the moment when the calendar and the cosmos shook hands. Inside the circle, archaeologists have found post holes, dark stains in the subsoil, where wooden uprights once stood, ghosts of structures, now returned to dirt. Imagine a timber lodge or ceremonial hall occupying the center, its doorway aligned with the same horizon gate the embankment marks. Picture processions stepping through, drums speaking for the heartbeats of a community, people entering a sanctified geometry where sky and soil conspired to remind them of the turning world. This was not casual labor. The Hopewell moved tons of earth with baskets and hands, translating astronomical patience into public works. If Stonehenge is Europe's famous verb for align, Anderson is Indiana's quieter synonym, equally deliberate, expressed in earth instead of stone. The Great Mound does not stand alone. Scattered through the park are 9 more earthworks, smaller circles, elongated ridges, and a rare figure-8 enclosure, 2 adjoining rings that feel, even now, like a path drawn for ritual movement. Each shape likely carried meaning processional routes, spaces set aside for ceremonies, vantage points for watching sky and season. Together they form a campus, a choreography of places where bodies and beliefs met on schedule. We do not have the script the builders recited, but the stage directions, entries, centers, sightlines are clearly legible in the ground. The world beyond these circles was not small. Artifacts associated with Hopewell circles across the Ohio Valley speak to a trade web so extensive it reads like a map of North America. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, mica from the Appalachians, copper glinting from the Great Lakes. Some of those materials, or their analogs, have been documented in the broader Anderson region, a quiet proof that this was a node in a network, a place where ideas and objects arrived by river and path to be reinterpreted in local hands. Imagine the gatherings when visitors came: smoke, song, news from far ridges and unfamiliar waters, the swapping of goods and stories as natural as breathing. And then, inevitably, the quieting. By around 400 AD, the Hopewell cultural pattern was changing. Ceremonial centers like this saw fewer feet. Reasons are as braided here as at Angel Mound centuries later, climate variability pinching yields, political realignments as communities refigured themselves, disease, shifts in ritual practice. There is no single ending event to point to, no ash layer, no catastrophe baked into the soil. There is only the historical truth that cultures evolve, that people turn their attention to new forms, and that even the most precise monuments can outlive the ceremonies that gave them breath. When settlers reached the White River country in the 19th century, they encountered the forms without the instructions. Some concluded, with that era's all-too-familiar bias, that the circles must be the work of far-off civilizations, Egyptians, Welsh wanderers, you name it, anything but the ancestors of the native nations whose histories lace this ground. The myth of mound builders who were not indigenous had staying power, because it let newcomers sidestep credit and continuity. Only later, under the slower discipline of archaeology and in conversation with descendant communities, did a more honest picture take hold. These earthworks are the work of peoples from this place, observing this sky, speaking in a design language proper to this valley. The 20th century added a practical kind of reverence. During the Great Depression, crews from the Works Progress Administration mapped and stabilized these earthworks, trading shovel and transit for the kind of attention that keeps a site alive in public memory. Eventually, the land became Mounds State Park, so anyone can walk the rim, cross the gateway, and, if they choose their morning, watch the sun, keep an appointment set 2,000 years ago. There are interpretive signs now. A small nature center, a trail network that draws joggers and families, and those who prefer their history with birdsong. If you go early, or go on the solstice. If you can, approach the opening in the embankment and let your eyes follow its aim point to the horizon. The moment the sun threads that passage, a hush falls, even if you are alone. It is not just beauty, though there is that. It is the shock of alignment. The sense that across centuries you have stepped into a groove worn by countless feet, that you are briefly part of a sentence the land still knows how to speak. You do not need to know the post-hole pattern by heart, or the copper's provenance, to feel the rightness of the place. The ground explains itself in light. Anderson is not grand in the way that travels easily on postcards. There are no towering stones, no carved stelae to pose beside. What it offers is subtler and, in a way, more intimate, proof that a community can collaborate with the sky using nothing but patient labor and an exacting eye. It tells a story that is both local and continental. A people who measured, marked, and met. A network that pulled materials and meanings along rivers as effortlessly as current pulls leaves. A tradition that set purpose into earth in a way that outlasted names. You could leave it there a pleasant morning, a lesson in prehistory, and you would have done well. But there is one more use for a place like this. It is a measuring stick for our own care. The builders made a promise in soil. We can answer it in stewardship, protecting what remains and listening to those whose ancestors authored the design. In that exchange between intention then and responsibility, now the circle closes. From here, the map arcs north and west into a river country that used to be more water than field, where mounds and village sites once dotted a wetland the size of a small sea. Much of it has been drained into rows, and the evidence with it. But listen closely. The land there still remembers, and after a hard rain, it sometimes speaks. Head up to Indiana's far northwest, and the land starts low and level, stitched with hedgerows and section lines, the Kankakee River sliding through it like a ribbon of dark glass. It reads, at first, as ordinary prairie fields, woodlots, a sky that can't help but be large. But the flatness is a disguise. Before ditches parceled the water into straightened veins, this was one of the largest wetlands in North America, a slow ocean of marsh and sedge. And long before it was drained into farmland, it was busy alive with camps, mounds, and seasonal villages that turned the Kankakee into an ancient thoroughfare. If Angel and Anderson show us how people pulled time from the sun, the Kankakee shows us how they pulled distance from water. The river connected everything. From the Great Lakes you could descend to the Kankakee, drift toward the Illinois, and from there enter the long body of the Mississippi. Goods, stories, and rituals rode those currents. Early settler accounts from places like Hebron, La Crosse, and English Lake mention low mounds that rose like punctuation marks in the cattails. Some burial, some defensive, some ceremonial, surrounded by shallow ditches that held spring rain like moats. Red ochre brightened the dead in certain graves, copper winked from others, and pottery sherds turned up under plow after the first good thaw, their patterns repeating motifs seen far to the south and east. The Kankakee was not an edge. It was a junction. Archaeology, when it could catch the region before it changed, suggested a long, layered occupation. Hopewell influences arrive between 100 BC and 500 AD. Their design language and trade webs leaving fingerprints in clay and copper. Later, Algonquian-speaking peoples, including ancestors of the Potawatomi and the Miami, used the wetlands with precision, reading the seasons like a ledger, fish runs and waterfowl migrations, stands of wild rice and cattail, winter shelter in wooded uplands, summer camps nearer the river's open lanes. The mounds whispered that some of those stays were not just overnight. There were places to return to. There were ceremonies to repeat. If the Ohio Valley's grand centers were cathedrals, the Kankakee was a parish network, smaller, numerous, and woven tight by water. Then the 19th and early 20th centuries arrived with a mandate: make land. Drainage projects squared off the marsh, dragged canals across it, and taught the water to behave, at least enough for plows to bite. The Kankakee Marsh shrank from inland sea to arithmetic. Fields measured in acres, not acres measured in ponds. With that engineering came loss that nobody tallied in time. Mounds collapsed under scraper blades. Others settled into the reworked soil, their outlines erased by the steady iron of cultivation. Looters made off with what they could lift. Museums absorbed labeled and unlabeled boxes. A great many finds never earned a tag. Arrowheads dropped into coffee cans, copper beads taped into family Bibles, stories recounted under porch light. Your grandfather turned this up after a rain. The destruction was comprehensive enough to feel like a final period. But the Kankakee does not quite accept endings. After a hard storm, the fields still speak. Pottery sherds push up in the tilled rows. Chert flakes shine like fish scales in the evening. Now and then, a slight rise in a field line gives itself away the last syllable of a mound that once held a story whole. You can read the country like a palimpsest if you are patient. A line of trees that follows the memory of a slough. A drainage ditch that accidentally tracks an old channel. A cluster of finds that implies a camp even when the earth refuses to draw the circle for you. And the rumors, inevitable as fog, have their place here too. The Kankakee country contributes its share to the ledger of giant bones, to tales of bark-wrapped burials revealed by floods, to medium-sized mysteries enlarged by excitement and the distance of time. As with Bone Bank and other sites, some of those accounts likely began with an honest find and grew in the space left by absent documentation. What matters, when we sift them now, is to let curiosity be disciplined by respect, to credit indigenous builders with what we can firmly hold in the archaeological hand, and to let the rest remain a question mark rather than an exclamation point. For all the loss, the story is not only elegy. A handful of archaeologists and avocational researchers are mapping what remains, cataloging collections, geo-referencing old notes, gently persuading landowners to let them walk fields after rain. Some local stewards are fencing small rises, marking them off from the plow, allowing grasses to root the soil against further erasure. It is slow work and rarely cinematic. But then, so was the making of the original landscape, basket by basket of earth, canoe by canoe, season by season. The pace is appropriate. The Kankakee's lesson, more than most, is about threshold vision. How to see in a landscape that has been revised twice over, first by water, then by survey. If Anderson's ring is a clean sentence, this region is the margin note, half-scrubbed, stubbornly legible in places. It asks for an ear tuned to whispers, the whisper of clay after rain, of a shell bead dulled by a century of dust, of family stories that begin. I am not sure if this matters, but it does. These small recoveries knit together into a net strong enough to hold at least the outline of what used to be. And that outline is already a marvel. You do not need a wall of stone to feel awe. A wetland will do. Imagine a procession of canoes sliding through rushes, a torchlit ceremony on a low rise, trade goods wrapped against the damp mica, copper, carved stone passing hand to hand. Imagine children learning the bends of a river the way others learn the alphabet. Imagine a place where the shortest path between the Great Lakes and the Gulf was not a line on a map, but a braided current under a migrating sky. That is the Kankakee, the mounds, remember. even as their bodies thin into fields. From here, our path curves toward a closing circle back to the question we started with. How do we decide what is real when the past speaks in fragments? We have walked cities elevated on earth, handled stones that ignite debate, watched a village erase under a river's patient teeth, traced fading lines in limestone, and followed a drained sea's afterimage. The answers are not singular. They rarely are. But in the hush of a solstice sunrise, or in the glint of a sherd after rain, you can feel the method and the wonder meet. In that meeting, we find our footing for what comes next. We began with a simple contrast. Pyramids and stone circles, oceans away versus unassuming Midwestern fields, and found instead a continent of meaning beneath Indiana's grass. Angel Mounds rose as a city of earth and intention, a Mississippian capital where power and ceremony climbed the same steps, and where trade routes tied the Ohio River to distant coasts. Newark's Holy Stones, whether clever 19th century theater or genuine anomalies, revealed how artifacts can become lightning rods for desire and doubt, dragging the public imagination into the same room as the archaeological method. At Bone Bank, the Wabash became an editor with a blunt eraser, chewing a bluff until a village blurred into fragments scattered across drawers and museum shelves. Vincennes offered sentences carved in limestone, a low voice speaking from a soft, eroding page. Anderson's earth rings showed the sky made local, a solstice aligned with an opening in the wall so precisely that a sunrise today still completes the builder's thought. And in the Kankakee country, a drained sea of wetland gave us the afterimage of a network, a parish of mounds and seasonal camps, braided by water, still whispering after rain. If there is a single answer to the question that started our walk, how do we decide what is real when the past speaks in fragments? It is this, with patience equal to the builder's own. The people who lifted platforms at Angel or drew a perfect circle at Anderson took years to learn the path of light across the horizon. Our task is to meet that patience with our own. Careful excavation instead of curiosity with shovels. Documentation instead of folklore alone. Consultation with descendant native nations instead of a one-way monologue. Rigor is not an enemy of wonder. It is the only way to keep wonder from being stolen by easy fictions. That does not mean we abandon the stories that cling to these places. It means we test them, hold them to the artifact, and see what survives. The giant tales from Posey, Knox, Anderson, and Vincennes persist because they satisfy a need to match the scale of effort with bodies large enough to lift it. But the mounds do not require myth to be impressive. Post holes and pottery, copper glinting from faraway mines, shell ornament shipped upriver. Like a letter, you could tell a complete and astonishing human story with just those. The Newark Stones, for their part, teach a different caution. Evidence has to be weighed in context, not only for what it says, but for when, where, and by whom it appeared. A compelling inscription without a firm archaeological setting is not a time machine. It is, at best, a prompt to go back to the trench and look again. There is humility in admitting how much we do not know. We cannot say exactly what was spoken atop Mound A, or which rites unfolded inside Anderson's Figure 8. We cannot rewind Bone Bank's bluff or relight the Kankakee's lanterns on the marsh. But not knowing is not the same as never knowing. New tools are sharpening the outlines, LiDAR peeling back tree cover to reveal earthworks hidden in the folds, ground-penetrating radar catching post patterns without a spade of soil disturbed, microbotanical and isotopic analyses tracing diets and trade to precise sources, 3D scans freezing petroglyphs before another winter rounds their edges down. None of these will hand us a script. Together they can thicken the margins and give descendant communities richer ground on which to share what the scientific record alone cannot. Stewardship is the hinge between then and now. Angel Mounds owes its clarity to decades of disciplined work. Anderson's rings stand because someone decided a Depression-era crew with transits and shovels mattered as much as any monument. By contrast, Bone Bank and much of the Kankakee remind us what happens when care arrives late or never. Knowledge dissolves into rumor, and rumor becomes the only narrator left. We can do better in the present tense by protecting what remains, by refusing to dig without a plan and a partner, by recognizing that a rise in a field or a scuffed stone at a river bend can be a chapter, not debris. Most of all, these places reframe where ancient lives. You do not have to book a flight to stand inside a sentence. The sky still completes. You do not need a carved stela to feel a law of motion, the sun lifting, threading a gate set 2,000 years ago, warming your face at the exact moment it warmed theirs. You do not need a mythic giant to feel small. A ring of earth will do. The extraordinary has always been here, written in soil and water, in cups of clay that once knew fireside conversation, in panels of limestone that still carry a fingertip's pressure across centuries. If you go, if this script has placed you at a trailhead, go early. At Angel Mounds, let the fog lie low as you climb. At Anderson, catch a solstice or at least a sunrise that understands the assignment. If you find the Vincennes stone, look with your shadow thrown just right, and read without touching. In the Kankakee country, walk the edges after rain, and listen for the field's quiet admissions. And wherever you stand, remember that the most faithful translation of these places won't come only from signs or videos, but from voices who inherit them. Seek out the words of the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, the Kickapoo, the many native nations whose histories lace this ground. The mounds and stones are records, yes. So are the living. We started by asking how to decide what is real when the past comes in pieces. The truest answer may be to let the pieces meet. Put the sunrise inside the ring. Put the copper bead beside the shell. Put the bluff's erosion next to the drawer's mislabeled pot. Put the rumor near the field note and see which one casts a longer shadow. If we can hold method and awe in the same hand, Indiana's quiet antiquity stops being an afterthought and becomes what it has always been, a center. Not an echo of Egypt or a cousin of Stonehenge, but a world complete in its own vocabulary. Earth, light, water, patience still speaking if we are willing to listen. Stand at the rim of a mound. The horizon brightens. For a heartbeat. The present and the past share a line. That is not myth. That is alignment. That is real.